Hello, everyone. It's again my privilege to welcome you on behalf of the Society. This program is a special one. It allows us to acknowledge the contributions Detlev F. Vagts to the field and to pay tribute to his longtime dedication to the Society. I want to start by really thanking the Vagts family for their generous gift, which has enabled the Society to create this as an annual event, now in its sixth year. We'll begin the program with a short presentation prepared by Detlev's daughters, Karen and Lydia Vagts.
Our father, Detlev Vagts, was a practicing lawyer, academic, author, and advocate for the field of transnational legal practice. He joined ASIL in 1961 and remained a devoted member for over 5 decades. ASIL was a professional home for him, a place where like-minded, internationally focused legal practitioners and scholars could convene. Every spring, there was a certain major event that he was sure to attend. On the home front, Dad was modest about his professional accomplishments. It was not until he passed away in 2013 that his family came to understand the extent of his contributions and influence. The remembrances from his peers made us realize that the work he wanted to support needed to continue, and ASIL seemed like the right organization for doing that.
Working with ASIL's leadership and key advisors, we decided to support a new program called the Detlev F. Vagts Roundtable on Transnational Law. Starting in 2016 and continuing for 10 years, the roundtable consists of a panel featured at the annual meeting. Each roundtable focuses on a different topic, but all topics reflect Dad's interests in promoting transnational law, interdisciplinary focuses, legal ethics, and the work of new scholars. The annual event provides a forum for a multi-sided and often lively discussion of a hot issue that reflects Dad's concerns. We are very grateful that ASIL has helped us provide this memorial to our father, which we hope will inspire future generations of transnational legal practitioners.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Gianluca Burce. I'm an adjunct professor of international law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And in my former professional life, a lawyer in the United Nations system for almost 30 years, including 10 years as legal counsel of the World Health Organization. It is my pleasure to introduce this roundtable, and I want to extend all my thanks to the American Society and to the family of Professor Detlev Vagts for making this roundtable possible. In particular, because it gives an opportunity for young scholars to present their work in progress and to receive feedback from a panel of commentators. So that will be the case today. As you can see from the title, the roundtable is about pandemic vaccines, market products, or global public goods. There couldn't be a hotter topic that involves us individually and as a community. And as you see from the media, from scholarly and policy discussion, a lot of attention goes to question of allocation, of equity, vaccine nationalism, manufacturing, which vaccine are safe, which vaccine are unsafe, and so on. But today we look at a different angle. In particular, the fact that to produce a vaccine, you need to have access to a sample of the pathogen or a genetic sequence of the pathogens. And that in turn has its own international legal regulation, in particular under biodiversity law. That has generated quite a number of problems and controversies and interesting issues that have really been involving closely the public health community. So to introduce the topic and present his paper today is Dr. Mark Ecclestone Turner. Dr. Ecclestone Turner is a lecturer in law at Keele University in the United Kingdom, And his specialization in particular is on international law and infectious diseases and communicable diseases, but in particular on vaccine. He's published extensively on vaccine. He has consulted with WHO on this topic. This paper is co-authored with Dr. Michelle Rourke, who cannot be here with us today. And she's a synthetic biology future science fellow, hell of a title, at Griffith University Law School in Brisbane, Australia, and a former officer of the Australian Army. Unfortunately, she cannot be with us today. So Mark will introduce his paper for about 15 minutes, and that will be followed by comments from three distinguished commentators. It's a very interdisciplinary panel that will introduce in turn when the time comes. So I give the floor without any further ado to Mark.
Thank you, Gianluca, and thank you to the Vagts family for having me today, and to the American Society. So, as Gianluca outlined, pathogens play a vital role in public health research. Effectively combating emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases requires a coordinated international response, including testing, surveillance, risk assessment, and the development of strain-specific vaccines and other medical countermeasures. Each of these vital activities relies upon prompt access to pathogens. And the international scientific community has been sharing pathogen samples informally for decades, monitoring the change in genetic sequences and hoping to detect a pandemic strain before it starts to take hold in the human population. But this soft global norm of informally sharing pathogen samples for scientific research and development has been eroded, and pathogen sample transfer is becoming increasingly formalized through a policy called access and benefit sharing, or ABS. The ABS legal landscape is dominated by the Convention on Biological Diversity and its supplementary agreement, the Nagoya Protocol. Nagoya is a binding international instrument on contracting parties that aims to ensure that the benefits arising from use of genetics resources are shared in a fair and equitable way. And it does this by introducing a form of property rights over biological resources and allowing contracting parties to govern access to those genetic resources. And the ABS mechanism originates in the bioconservation space, but has now been extended beyond biodiversity and into international public health governance. It is my argument today that it is not fit for purpose in this space. The extension of ABS from biodiversity into public health has most clearly occurred through the WHO Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, or the PIP framework. PIP codifies the use of the ABS transaction in the public health space, with WHO acting as a mediating multilateral mediator, sitting at the constellation of transactions between member states providing samples and third-party users of influenza viruses with human pandemic potential. This transaction is framed as being particularly appealing for developing countries who, in a pandemic, may not be able to secure access to vaccines through purely commercial arrangements. These countries also happen to be the site of the most of emerging and rare, and therefore at a scientific and transactional level, valuable influenza strains. However, it doesn't change the sovereignty question here. In fact, it actively embraces sovereignty. Countries can exercise their sovereign authority over their pandemic influenza viruses by choosing to share their viruses either through the multilateral PIP framework, or they can enter into a bilateral access and benefit sharing arrangement through the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. Either way, pathogen sharing, be it via the PIP framework, the CBD, or Nagoya, is a transaction, the exchange of a pathogen for a benefit. One thing in exchange for something else. These transactional approaches are meant to encourage developing countries to use their pathogen genetic resources as bargaining chips to secure enhanced access to diagnostics, medicines, and vaccines. And the mediating role of WHO in the PIP framework is intended to deliver a more equitable solution that does not just benefit the country of origin or the party accessing the sample. On the surface, this sounds like a good solution, a win-win. But the ABS transaction applied to pathogens introduces market solutions to what were two previously separate problems. The first, the need for public health researchers to secure access to novel pathogens for research. And second, the scarce availability of vaccines and other medical countermeasures during a pandemic, where rich countries dominate access and leave developing countries to fend for themselves. In this paper, we argue that these are actually allocation efficiency problems. And the market-based solution of ABS that was designed to address a market failure in biodiversity is not the right approach to addressing public health. Instead, linking these two public health problems through an ABS transaction solves neither problem. It's important to recognize that ABS was never just about biodiversity conservation. It's also supposed to deliver fairness, equity, and redress some historical injustices, especially in post-colonial settings. Historically, botanists and natural scientists from the global north traveled to the global south and extracted local biological resources, plant and animal species, without seeking permission from either the local community or the national government. They essentially saw these biological resources of the global south as public goods. These biological resources were then expropriated to the global north, where they were used for a range of applications, from medicine to objets d'art. These exploitative practices continue to this day when it comes to pathogens. There are very clear recent examples of exploitation in the field of public health, from H5N1, Ebola in West Africa, Zika, and MERS. And we don't seek to downplay or minimize the exploitation of these marginalized people at the hands of researchers. But ABS has done little to achieve its goals in biodiversity conservation, and we don't believe that it can achieve its goals in public health. And we're increasingly alarmed by the continued push towards using ABS in public health, where the incentives and goals are very different from those in environmental conservation. And at the moment, WHO is engaging in a process of researching the pathogen sharing practices and analyzing the potential impact that the Nagoya Protocol is going to have on public health. This process started in 2009, and there are discussions at WHO and in other forums about extending the PIP framework to include other pathogens, using PIP as a model for multilateral ABS for all human pathogens, or creating an entirely new multilateral ABS framework for pathogens. We think this is a bad idea for a host of reasons, and I'm going to spend some of my time outlining some of these, what these are. Now, whether bilateral or multilateral, pathogen ABS is a transaction. It's a quid pro quo, something in exchange for something else. And bilateral pathogen ABS means that benefits accrue to those who are best placed to negotiate them, and not to those who will benefit most from them. And while multilateral pathogen ABS may be better equipped at pooling some benefits to distribute those to nations most in need during an emergency, it's always going to be vulnerable to nations acting outside of multilateral arrangements and engaging in bilateral ABS, which may be more beneficial for the country in question, but not the world as a whole. One of the key problems with ABS transactions is that they pit each party against each other in a buyer-seller paradigm with opposing incentives. And while the providers and users of pathogen samples have some common interests, such as reducing transactional costs, there's a much stronger opposing interest. Each stakeholder is looking to maximize their gains and minimize their costs. Providers of sovereign pathogen samples want to maximize benefit sharing, whereas users would want to minimize benefit sharing. The PIP framework was meant to ensure that this transaction was brokered more effectively by WHO for some influenza viruses. And in a multilateral ABS transaction with an WHO acting as an intermediary party, the system is most attractive to providers of sovereign genetic resources if they can maximize the likelihoods that benefits will accumulate to them specifically. But for users, the multilateral system is most attractive if all providers are using it and nobody is prepared to provide similar genetic resources outside of the system at a lower cost. Providers would prefer strong monitoring, compliance, and enforcement, whereas users would likely prefer the opposite. The multilateral mechanism is a less direct transaction, but the opposing incentives and market dynamics are still at play here. A second key problem is that WHO as a public health organization can only provide benefits from a multilateral ABS system in a way that accords with public health need. But for multilateral ABS to work, the provider parties need incentives or rewards to actually provide pathogen samples. They want benefits in exchange for the act of sharing their sovereign genetic resources. But the WHO can only promise the possibility of benefits, not a one-to-one exchange of access to pathogens for vaccines and antiviral medications. So the link between the act of providing access to the sharing of benefits is too weak to discourage free riding in this space. Countries can simply elect not to submit their influenza samples to WHO through the PIP framework and can still expect to receive benefits if their country exhibits the greatest need during an influenza pandemic. This destroys the incentives required to ensure that the countries continue to provide samples to the system and that the system is not readily undermined by bilateral ABS agreements. Another issue in creating a market for human pathogens is that it will introduce the dynamics of supply and demand. Some viruses will be common and easily available, and their value in the ABS transaction will be minimal. Some viruses will be rare and difficult to access, and their value will be comparatively large. The scarcity that can make a pathogen valuable in ABS terms is predicated on that pathogen being contained, whether in terms of in one country or within the sovereign territory of one or two nations. In such instances, there are limited options for potential users of these pathogens, such as pharmaceutical companies, to access these resources, and they will therefore be required to negotiate with the nation that happen to have the pathogen in situ. At that point, the nation may be able to negotiate very favorable terms through a bilateral ABS agreement, securing benefits for their populations, possibly for the supply of vaccines or medical countermeasures. However, it's a truism of public health that infectious diseases do not respect international boundaries. And the moment the pathogen crosses the territorial border of that nation and begins to spread internationally, the negotiation position of the originator state is significantly hampered or wholly eroded. This recently occurred with Zika. When Zika hit Brazil in 2015, US and European researchers were keen to obtain new samples. As Brazilian lawyers negotiated the terms for their access and the use of the viral samples, which at the time were contained solely within Brazil, the US government, the Zika virus spread into Puerto Rico, a US territory. And at that point, the US Centers of Disease Control could obtain new Zika virus samples from Puerto Rico. The negotiations with Brazil ended without the transfer of any Zika samples from Brazil. And the Brazilian government found out the hard way that their bargaining position disappeared as soon as the disease spread and researchers could find alternative providers of pathogen samples. Such are the dangers of pursuing bilateral ABS in a public health emergency from the perspective of the provider or the supply side of ABS. The desire of provider governments to secure benefits to protect their populations by leveraging one of the few bargaining chips they have can backfire, leaving vulnerable populations even more vulnerable. When viewed through the lens of an ABS transaction, the most valuable pathogens are the ones that are both rare and stand to threaten the lives of the most number of people. This is clearly perverse, and the supply and demand dynamics can also undermine the delivery of fair and equitable outcomes. And this is what Brazil learned during the Zika outbreak. WHO acting as a transactional clearinghouse, connecting the provision of viruses to the provision of scarce vaccines is a folly, and it's potentially a very dangerous one. When we're considering ABS way of protecting developing countries from infectious diseases, then we see that the bilateral ABS transaction can create a situation where only one country gets benefit, and that benefit might actually be more effectively distributed elsewhere. And ABS negotiations can be threatened by the open availability of genetic sequence data or the pathogen spread into other nations, which dilutes incentives to share benefits. On the other hand, while a multilateral ABS system managed by WHO could be more effectively accrue benefits, it can only share them on an as-needs basis, not in a manner that encourages provider parties to continue to engage with the sharing process. Such as are the dangers of pitting stakeholders as buyers and sellers in an ABS transaction, creates a market environment where individualism and competition are valued over cooperation. And in a public health emergency, as we've seen, cooperation is hard to come by, but it's absolutely key to tackling a pandemic. The last thing we need is yet another system that codifies and enhances the incentives for individualism over cooperation. Unlike most physical resources, in many respects, culturable pathogen samples can be non-exhaustive and their use non-exclusive. Some pathogens can be grown and replicated to the point where an infinite number of replicate samples exist. In a sense, anyone can consume as much of a pathogen as desired without diminishing the amount that's available for others. Therefore, in a marketplace, pathogens might be better understood as being information rather than a physical resource. Despite this, the current approach to pathogen ABS treats pathogens as tangible assets that a state can exercise sovereign rights over, something akin to property rights, where the rights holders can exclude others from accessing or using the tangible resources without consent. So far, I've covered some of the ABS, some of the reasons why ABS transactions and a market-based solution in this place may not be appropriate for public health. These have all been technical issues about supply and demand and market-based incentives, but there's also a human rights argument to be made here. We go into this in a fair bit of detail in the paper, but ultimately, the framing of this issue of fair and equitable access to vaccines as part of an ABS transaction reduces equitable access to vaccines to something that can be traded if you're fortunate enough to hold a pathogen of value, rather than viewing equitable access to vaccines as an innate right which all people have claim to, regardless of how much their government happens to have engaged in the bilateral or multilateral trade in pathogens. Developing countries should not have to purchase fairness and equity with their sovereign genetic resources. It really is as simple as that. And the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic provides us with a really interesting example of these issues. Within the context of COVID-19, there was no meaningful discussion around providing access to COVID-19 vaccines linked to the provision of samples of SARS-CoV-2. This could be for a number of reasons, but all of them point to the fact that ABS transactions cannot work in a public health emergency. And multilateral ABS instruments for the sharing of all pathogens ought to be reconsidered. China released the genetic sequence of the novel coronavirus quickly, and access to genetic and physical samples from other countries followed that soon after. By the time any source country had the chance to negotiate an ABS agreement in the early stages of the pandemic, in the hope of potentially securing fair and equitable access to vaccines for their population, the values of the samples were minimal, if not completely negligible. This again highlights a key problem with applying ABS in public health. The logic of ABS can actively discourage the sharing of pathogens in the early days of an outbreak, while the provider country attempts to negotiate the best possible ABS agreement. This is precisely when the world most needs access to these pathogen samples. Thankfully, in COVID, there was no quid pro quo, and it's perhaps indicative of the problems of trying to connect these in the first place. Not all pathogens are like pandemic flu, and not all will have characteristics that conform as well to an ABS transaction. And influenza does not even conform well to ABS either. Rather than being an anomaly, COVID might point to the fact that ABS mechanism cannot be a solution to either of these two problems in public health. The previous failings of the ABS regime in Zika, Ebola, and MERS that we cover in our paper indicate that a transaction of a pathogen for medicines is not fair and it's not an efficient. It's not fair and it's not efficient, and it's not fair or efficient for either the rapid access to pathogen samples or the fair and equitable access to vaccines resulting from their use. To sum up, bilateral or multilateral, ABS creates yet another space in which providers and users are antagonists, buyers and sellers, both of whom want to maximize their own gains. But this framing ignores the fact that there are mutual interests here. And the whole point of the UN system is to encourage cooperation between nations who sometimes have disparate but similar interests. And we need to start to think outside of the market-based mechanisms that have perpetuated unfair dealings and continue to detriment developing nations. There was and there is a solid normative basis for the expectation that viruses and other pathogens should be shared now. It's a norm that, to some extent, was upheld by China when they shared the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 quickly and freely in the very early days of the pandemic. On the one hand, the world is relying on a norm to be able to respond to infectious disease outbreaks, while on the other, it's actively undermining this norm with the application of ABS policies. The norm needs to be strengthened, and it could be strengthened if developing countries were not made to feel that ABS policies were their only opportunity to get access to vaccines and antivirals in an emergency. We should be looking to solve these problems in parallel. Linking these two issues in a mechanism designed to address a market failure in biodiversity guarantees that neither access to pathogens nor the sharing of benefits associated with their use will occur in a fair and equitable manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That the very clear position against the market mechanism. So I guess we need to also look at other devices that you mentioned at the end of your talk. And obviously, human rights considerations can play a role there. So we are fortunate now to have, as I said, a very interdisciplinary panel, which is maybe not so customary in a academic meeting of international lawyers. And I'm very happy because we can have fairly diverse reactions and comments on Mark's presentation. So our first commentator is Professor Suri Moon, who is a colleague and a friend, and she's professor from practice in the political science department at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva, and she's a co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute. So Suri, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Gianluca. My thanks also to the Vagts family and the American Society for the opportunity, and to Dr. Ecclestone Turner for a really interesting paper and very thought-provoking presentation. I think that I'll begin with 2 points on which I think we're in full agreement before I offer some areas where I see things a bit differently. So where am I in full agreement? I think certainly from a public health perspective, from an epidemiological and ethical perspective, we want free-flowing sharing of pathogen samples and genomic sequencing data. We want free and open sharing of vaccines and other technologies that might be derived from those genetic resources. And I think that would indeed be a much better world. I am also in full agreement that the existing rules that we have don't produce either of those outcomes. And the existing system of rules is certainly not fit for purpose. But what I'd like to do is highlight, I think, three areas where I think the paper could be further developed, and where I see things a little bit differently. And the first is when we think about the existing rules not being fit for purpose, I think we have to look a little bit more at what are the existing rules for access and how weak and practically non-existent those rules are for access to countermeasures. The second point is that legally binding rules, which are very scarce for those who are on the short end of the stick when it comes to access to technologies, legally binding rules are useful leverage. They are important legal leverage, and they have value in the global system that we're operating in today. The last point I'd like to make, which is somewhat counterintuitive perhaps, is that rules are not enough, and that the rules, certainly the rules we have, don't go far enough, and that it's important also to keep in mind some of the material factors, and I think some of my other colleagues will speak to the importance of production capacity, et cetera. So before I dive into these 3 points, I wanted to flag that I don't actually share the characterization of the current ABS system as a market, or at least not as a purely market-based system. I think it's a system that is shot through with politics and power relations, and perhaps as a political scientist, that might be why I see power and politics everywhere. And if we think about COVID-19 vaccines today as a strategic asset, not just as a market commodity, we can understand a little bit better the current distribution and why certain countries have access to those vaccines. And I think what we see when we look at the pattern of countries that do have access is the operation of quid pro quo everywhere. And so indeed, it would be a more beautiful world if vaccines were not distributed based on a logic of quid pro quo, but actually that's the world that at least I observe today. What is that quid pro quo? You give me vaccines, I give you money. That's a market transaction. But we also see you give me vaccines, I will allow you to run clinical trials in my country on my people. Or you give me vaccines and I'll give you a political favor. I'll either vote with you on the Security Council or in the General Assembly or in some other intergovernmental political process for which diplomatic friends can be useful. And we see all of this playing out right now. So it's certainly not a pure, at least in my view, a pure market, a market situation. But turning to the 3 points that I wanted to flag. First, existing rules are not fit for purpose. When we look at the situation today, it's very clear that we don't have effective global rules to ensure access to vaccines or other health technologies. If we had them, we wouldn't see the huge disparities that I think are obvious. Nobody disputes there are major global inequalities in access today. We do have certain rules that do protect those who develop and manufacture vaccines. For example, the TRIPS agreement that sets out minimum standards for intellectual property protection, which are binding, a number of trade agreements and investment agreements in which IP rules are embedded. We basically don't have binding rules, however, for access. We do have the PIP framework, which was mentioned earlier, but interestingly, governments did not agree to make the PIP framework a treaty. They did not agree to make the PIP framework to elevate that to the level of international law. And so it's binding in other ways through contracts, but we have very little actually leverage when we think about, how can we use international law to improve access? This leads me to my second point. Legal rules can offer leverage. So what do we have? What we do have is the Nagoya Protocol, which the government of Indonesia did use and made use of this treaty in order to strengthen its claims over its H5N1, over its influenza samples about 15 years ago, and other countries have similarly followed suit since then. But I do think that the few sources of legal leverage that are available to, in particular to developing countries who might not have the money or the political sway to get vaccines through other means, Nagoya will offer a very important source of power and leverage that countries are unlikely to give up. And then this leads me really to my last point. where can we go from here? So we agree the existing rules don't work. I think the existing rules, different rules favor different parties. And so how do we get out of this mess? I'm not sure that human rights norms are going to get us out of this mess because, of course, these predate COVID, and certainly they have not been strong or specific enough to change the current situation. I think there have been some very interesting proposals being put forward and actively debated now for new rules. And I think until we have new binding rules that are reliable to indeed create multilateral arrangements for access to both samples and the benefits that might result, we're not going to see movement on resolving the spaghetti bowl that we have before. As my last comment, maybe I'll just flag that. At the end of the day, as I said, I think we do need these new rules, but that these rules only go so far. And that indeed, when countries have the capacity to produce, whether it's vaccines or drugs or diagnostics, they are in a much stronger position. That many countries, developing countries in particular, are either actively building up this capacity or certainly will be very interested in doing so post COVID. I think that will be necessary in addition to any kind of new rules in order to truly ensure that we have global access. And so there's there's a long way to go. And I share certainly Dr. Ecclestone Turner's concern that the current system we have is definitely not good enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suri. Very interesting remarks, in particular on the exercise of power and politics. So those are also transactional aspect. Vaccine diplomacy has become a feature of the last couple of years. China, Russia, India also, I think, using vaccine as an instrument of foreign policy. On the new rules, the Director General of WHO, I understand, made a statement yesterday for the session of the American Society that unfortunately I couldn't listen to. And he's a big proponent of a new pandemic treaty. So he also very much advocates the need for new rules to ensure, among other things, access, not only access and benefits, something that is missing at this point in the public health landscape. And so we'll see how it develops. There's quite a momentum building behind this proposal. Okay, a next commentator comes from a very different background, from a public health background, Beatrice Tome. She's a public health physician affiliated with the preventive medicine department of the Federal University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And she's also the co-chair of the WHO Ethics and COVID-19 Working Group. So a public health and ethics background. That's very interesting, and looking forward to your comments, Beatrice.
Thanks, Gianluca, and thanks to everyone, particularly to you, Mark, for the opportunity to comment on such an interesting paper. And as Gianluca introduced, as a public health physician, you do experience, you if you work long enough in public health, you do go through these situations of exploitative sample sharing and lacking access to the benefits, especially being a researcher in Brazil. But you don't necessarily have all this background that you provided in your paper. So all the, the legal framework behind the mechanisms that we currently have, to me, was a deep dive into these legal bases, and I found it very interesting. And again, despite being a very different a very different background, I found the paper very fluid and easy to read. So congratulations for making a public health physician read a law paper. So really well done. But a couple of things to pick up, and also so good to hear Suri's as well. I think one thing I wanted to start with is, right in the introduction, you state that this what the discussion that you're going to have is on the premises that medicines and in our situation now during COVID, access to resources, being vaccines and oxygen and all resources that we have been needed to to deal with the pandemic is a human right. So the human rights approach to that, and that resonates with me very much because being a Brazilian physician and a Brazilian citizen, you might be aware we have a public health system that is based on human rights grounds and based on human as health as a human right, really, and secured in our constitution. So it's in our legal basis that the state should provide health for all, and with no co-participation, no enrollment. So it's really health for everyone. And of course, we've heard anyone that works in health financing will find this impossible to put together. How can a system work for everyone in a country as populous as Brazil with such inequities? And it is a challenge. And for me, being working in the public health system in Brazil for years, and my generations behind me, it is a day-to-day challenge. But what we have ahead of us is this goal of our mission is to really provide health as a right, really. So I think we shouldn't, as we move forward in this conversation, how picking up on Suri's questions, how do we move forward? We shouldn't lose this from our as our guidance, really. And as part of that, because I guess a question that I would second, Suri, is like, your paper really describes why ABS is not, an ideal way to be nor efficient nor equitable. How do we do this then? And I think your discussion could be perhaps more enriched towards what are then the legal frameworks that could be proposed. And you do bring some ethical principles without necessarily going too much in depth, but you do bring equity, you bring fairness, you bring justice. So you sort of lay out, in, of course, very at a high level, what would be an ethical framework for this to happen. But then my question to you, moving forward, would be, what would be a legal framework that would be more appropriate to address, to be aligned with this ethical framework that you somewhat surfaced, and to be aligned with this goal, which is to have access as a right, really. And that, if I can contribute, because again, my lens is this from a public health perspective, I would like to get the chance to comment on a report that was published by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics at the beginning of last year, coincidentally together with the emergence of the new coronavirus crisis. And this report, so we worked on the evidence that we had on other public health emergencies and what were the ethical challenges to conduct research. So research is the lenses of this report, and again, what are the key challenges in conducting research in such emergencies. And then at that time, we worked with experiences from H1N1, Ebola, and Zika. But I think you can take out some juice from this report that can perhaps help you base your legal framework on moving forward. But just to say that we had a call for evidence around the world. We collected experience from researchers and governments and donors when dealing with these public health emergencies, and something that came out very strongly with the considerations of when and how biological samples provided during public health emergencies could be ethically used. And the main things that came out was that it was really ethical, that they should be used to the maximum of their benefit possible. But the issue was always on how access was provided to those benefits. But just to bring up the working group's approach to this was twofold. So one, to really try to promote responsible sharing, which includes that ensuring that samples, once they're shared, they're again used to optimum effect to help reduce suffering. Again, so always bringing it back to an ethical lens. And the second aspect of that, to really promote equitable sharing. So this again, it really speaks to you, to the points that you raise in your paper, how in general low-income environments won't have the same opportunities as stakeholders in high-income environments in terms of accessing benefits. And we brought this call as a call for action, really, that across the research endeavor, from researchers, research participants, and donors and founders of research, these two, responsible sharing and equitable sharing, should be at the top priorities when again, when funding research, when conducting research. And again, it's a different perspective, because again, it's focused on research, but I think you might find that helpful. And out of this work, we also report on an example from after Zika, as you well mentioned. There was it was, and at the time when we were in Brazil during the Zika crisis, I can tell you there was a black market for Zika samples at this point, because as you well described, it was really hard to get samples out of Brazil. So of course the black market was installed, as it normally is. But after that, there were a couple of consortiums around Zika, so Zika Plan, Zika Alliance, that are mostly funded through the EU. And for example, there was a creation of a biobank to really try to overcome these challenges of sharing and access to samples. And I think this is also, again, of course, this biobank has to respect governments and the regulations of each of the countries that are participating. But nevertheless, there's this idea of collaboration that you brought in your paper, that you brought as you spoke just now, as the backbone of how do we do this moving forward. And then the legal framework, I guess, again, if we have our north, it's everything else is how do we get there, and collaboration, I guess, will be a key word there. And I guess I'll stop there, but thanks again.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you very much. I like in particular your reference at the end to alliances, biobanks. So already showing possible alternative paths to move in the current scenario to make things more equitable and to hopefully improve access down the line. So there's definitely something to discuss further. So last but not least, I'm very pleased that we have Dr. Yuvraj Dalvi. He's a team lead of the intellectual property cell at the Serum Institute of India, which at this point, I think it's the largest vaccine manufacturers in the world, if not one of the largest manufacturers. So I'm very pleased that we can have the perspective of the vaccine industry from the Global South. And we are very much looking forward to your comments, Yuvraj.
Yeah, Mark's paper sets the foundation for the aspect that is the strain providers have been deprived of the benefits. So that aspect is pretty clear with the precedents set and the examples given. But the paper does not elaborate on the alternative incentive mechanisms. It doesn't propose the mechanisms precisely. So we would begin initially with what are the inherent gaps of the ABS PIP. The framework should be applicable to any pathogen. I mean, it should go beyond viruses, beyond pandemics. The second aspect is giving WHO vaccine doses for free, which is part of the PIP model, or giving royalty-free license to vaccine manufacturers of the country from which the strain originated to manufacture the said product is not a feasible approach from the vaccine manufacturer's return on investment perspective, because with due consideration of the extensive R&D, scale-up required for developing a safe and efficacious product, huge facilities, skilled manpower investment. Third aspect is WHO as a mediator for MTAs creates a lot of legal uncertainties which need to be addressed. The fourth aspect is scenarios would be definitely different for the naturally occurring strains than the genetically modified strains as far as the strain providers, the intermediate modifiers, and the final vaccine manufacturers are concerned. That is where we need to have out-of-box incentive mechanisms in place. So here I would like to propose certain benefit sharing mechanisms. I have segregated them as to individual capacity, the research organizations, the institutions, and then the governments. So first we'll go with the individual capacity. The option one could be having an MTA stage one research, commercial agreements as stage two product stage, signed directly between the vaccine manufacturers and the strain providers. It could be university or individual, to remove all the legal uncertainties. The option second is involve the national culture laboratories. Like you have the European Culture Collection, ATCC, instead of WHO labs, which would be better positioned for ascertaining through MTAs that patent rights, ownership of the strain provider is taken care of. This will happen in two ways. First is by designating strain provider's name as IP joint applicant. And the second way is connecting the manufacturer to the strain provider for execution of necessary commercial agreements, providing financial rewards to the strain provider in particular when the commercial product is about to be launched. Now we move on to the proposed benefit sharing mechanisms for country governments who provide the strains. We could designate most favored nation status to these countries who are providing the strain, and following are the facilities that they can be availing. The first is special discounted or differential pricing that we have done before for HPV vaccine, HCV drugs, for pandemic product or any existing or future products. Second is we could have differential licensing agreements. For instance, minimum licensing fee, royalty fee for their manufacturing and selling in their own country. The third thing is differential know-how agreements along with infringement waiver for manufacturing and selling vaccine in the origin country only. Then we have cross-licensing agreements with the said country vaccine manufacturers. Other thing is settlement of IP litigations if there are any between the two countries. Donation to origin country pandemic emergency fund is another option available. The first foreign country to receive vaccine supply, the strain provider could be given at least 30% of the population considered as tier 1, and rest of the countries under COVAX like mechanism tier 1, only 20% of the population may be covered. Now, the question that arises here is, we have proposed mechanisms, but how do we ensure the compliance and how do we encourage the vaccine manufacturers to comply with these proposed mechanisms? There are certain aspects here. Before launch of any commercial product, voluntary self-declarations by vaccine manufacturers indicating that product utilizes the strains and that the requisite party has been given the benefit. Such declaration can be submitted to the Ministry of Health of each country where vaccine is intended to be sold, like we already do it for the FTO IP infringement clearance. Such kind of clearance letters are required by the Ministry of Health of the respective country. The second is fast track processing of patent applications covering the product. There also we can have self-declaration similarly. The third option is fast track processing of regulatory approvals by country FDAs. Again, we can have a self-declaration in place. The fourth and the most important thing here is, which is coming from a live example of Malaysia in 2019 and 2020. They have set a precedence and they are way ahead in terms of incentive sharing with the strain providers. You can have random checks of commercial products by competent state regulatory authorities for presence of documents indicating benefit sharing agreement in the form of a permit, maybe, has been appropriately done. If not, then asking the manufacturer to comply. Now, this could be associated with nominal penalties, could be decided. Now, that's all from my side. And I would like to thank Serum Institute senior management as well as the DC VMN fraternity for nominating me for this particular interesting discussion.
Thank you, Yuvraj. You definitely brought the industry perspective, which is, for the moment, obviously and legitimately very much transactional, but you can see the room for improvements and for alternative solutions to equity between strain providers and receiver. We have 10 minutes before we adjourn, and I wonder whether Mark would like to react to some of the comments. Before I give him the floor, as attendees may know, we have the possibility to continue the conversation right after the end of this session. So I hope that the Mark and my colleagues can all stay for 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so. We'll reconnect, and I hope that some of the attendees will come on and there will be a question and answer, because the format of this roundtable prevents interaction with the audience, but we have a chance after the end of the session. Mark, would you like to reflect a bit on what you heard, to give some responses, some fire back, whatever?
Yes, and thank you all so much for your helpful comments. And I think it's really interesting and so helpful to get perspectives from three very different disciplines, and also disciplines that are not just international lawyers talking to other international lawyers. Because I think one of the things that's really interesting about this space is that it does cut across private industry, it cuts across public health, and it cuts across power. And global politics, and it's not just a legal issue, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so interesting. And just on that point of power, which is one of the things I've been thinking about the most out of about these comments, is that you're absolutely right, Suri, that there are these huge power differentials at play here. And those power differentials exist within the framework of the Nagoya Protocol. You know, the idea of providers and users, sellers and buyers. And developing countries are just not often in a position to be able to turn down deals that appear to be beneficial in the short term, even if they may not be beneficial or may even be detrimental in the long term. Whereas developed nations and their industries are often very much in a position to make these strategic moves that will better secure their interests in the long term. And sharing data and information and collaborative research with nations is often touted as one of the potential benefits from the ABS transaction, not just actual vaccines. And I think that's one of the interests. This is simply good research ethics. This is not about benefits coming back in return, but framing ABS as if it's provider countries only deserve these benefits if they purchase them with their sovereign genetic resources, I think is a really interesting thing. And we've extended that into vaccines as well. You are entitled, or you are worthy of receiving vaccines because you provided into you had a bilateral agreement here. And I think that really does detract from the strong normative basis, even if there's not a strong legal basis, of things like the human right to health and access to medicine under the human right to health. And you're absolutely right. That's probably not a strong legal solution in this case. But I worry that the framing these issues as transactions actually detracts from that norm. And I think that norm has value in a political sense, even if it doesn't necessarily have strong legal basis underpinning it. And that's one of the things that I worry about in this sort of further push to further transactionalize these issues, whether bilateral or multilateral. I think that we're moving away from the importance of the norm itself. And that's one of the things that I think is most challenging in this space. And I think each one of you have challenged me and I have explained that our paper sets out very, very well what the problem is. Now you want to know what the solution is. And I really wish I knew the answer to that one. And I really wish I could give you the answer in 7 minutes, because I mean, that is ultimately the $1 million question here. And it's one that I don't have to hand. And I think one of the problems I have with Nagoya, and one of the problems I have with ABS transactions in general, is that it's presented as a solution. That we don't need to fix access to medicines because we've got Nagoya. You can just leverage. You can just use your pathogens as leverage. Whereas we don't actually have any examples, either in the public health space or really in the environmental conservation space, of a lower middle income country being able to use their pathogens or use their sovereign biological resources as a leverage. I can't actually think of a single example where a country has been able to successfully do that. But even if they were able to successfully do that, let's say Indonesia in 2005 had managed to get a really good deal for Indonesia. Okay, that's great for Indonesia. What about Laos? What about Cambodia? What about any low and middle income countries around the world, not just countries that neighbor Indonesia? What about them? Because the bilateral ABS transaction says that it's an all or nothing game. All of the benefits go to the one country that was able to successfully negotiate this agreement in time. And we don't actually have an example of that occurring in practice. But even if it did, we're at a situation where one country gets everything and all of the other countries who may have equal or greater need get nothing. And I think that we need to think a lot more creatively about global solutions to these problems. And multilateral ABS is presented as if it's that global problem, but we think that it does suffer these huge market inefficiencies, which actually disincentivize access and pathogen sharing. And myself and Michelle are very much on the record about what we think about the PIP framework and the fact that we actually don't think it can distribute benefits. when it's actually needed. And Michelle and I have both written quite a lot about that. So there has to be a solution here. I don't know what it is, but transactions are not that solution, is my position on that. Jean-Luc, I don't know if you wanted to chime in with something on these discussions, or you as the chair, because you obviously know a lot and write.
We have 5 minutes to go, so not much time to develop my question. But so your point about the weakness of this bilateral transactional approach is very well taken. So we need a multilateral solution probably, and I think the PIP framework tried that in its own way by placing WHO at the center of a system where benefits would be pooled, would be available for responding to need rather than responding to reward for providing an asset. There are also probably less formal solutions. For example, the alliances that Beatrice was talking about. There was a Zika alliance, other maybe more informal relationship among laboratories, among stakeholders that can facilitate access to pathogens and also to benefits. So I think there can be a range of solutions at different normative levels, not just at the treaty level, the formal international law level, but at transactional level, at the level of a relationship among non-state stakeholders like labs, like scientists, and so on. So I'm not saying that this will be the perfect solution, probably not, it would be very inadequate, but there's a range of possible multilateral options. And if you talk to sort of the left-wing NGOs, they love Nagoya because it gives leverage to mega diverse countries that hold the biodiversity that the industries of the North want. And so they say, don't throw Nagoya out with the bathwater. Nagoya allows you, for example, multilateral solution, allows you partial carve-outs that can respond to the most specific needs of public health, including possibly to overcoming the systemic weakness of this bilateral approach that you were mentioning. So I think the space for discussion there. And as Suri was saying, we don't have new rules for the moment. We should work on new rules, but until they come, we should try to make the current system work as best as it can. And certainly trying to remedy some of the deficiency that you were talking about. And in particular, I agree with you, this sort of a bilateral approach, which to me is one of the main challenges in the CBD and Nagoya. That certainly was not designed for public health, was designed for totally different biological resources and to give political leverage to developing countries and to deter biopiracy, very different set of problems. But anyway, your paper raises quite a number of important issues. I think it gives a strong criticism of a model. So we need to reflect about alternatives, both within the current landscape and maybe to think of new rules, because this pandemic treaty discussion is here to stay. I think we have a number of events this year, political events, including G7, G20, the WHO Assembly, the UN General Assembly, where these things may take momentum. So it would be a pity if these aspects of equity in access versus also equity in sharing would be lost. I'm sure the industry, at least the most powerful pharmaceutical industry, will put up a fight if it touches the bottom line. But I think COVID shows that there is a global health security dimension that should be seen as an overarching framework and within which we need to accommodate different interests. So I will stop at that, unless there are final 30 seconds urgent comments. I think we can log off. Many thanks again. I think Surya is yeah, go ahead, please.
Because I can't resist, and we have 90 seconds. I think the one thing that I would like to flag is that it doesn't have to be an either or. That reciprocity, for example, you give me a sample, I give you vaccines, does not have to exclude broader solutions. If we think about from the ethics of clinical trials, participants often do have a claim and are recognized to have an ethical claim to benefit from the product that they help to test. It doesn't mean that the rest of the population should not also get access to the product. And so I think for me, I don't see that it necessarily erodes a norm of access to a medicine as a human right, to also say those who contributed to enable the development of that medicine should benefit from the final medicine that results. I think those are not necessarily in opposition.
Very good point. Many thanks. So with this, I think we log off, and I hope that attendees will come back in a few minutes for the continue the conversation, and that we can have and continue this interesting exchange. Many thanks to the American Society. Again, many thanks to the families of Professor Vagts for making this possible, and enjoy the rest of the annual meeting of the American Society. Goodbye, and many thanks to, obviously, to Mark and to my fellow panelists.